Chapter 17. With an exhilarated cry of relief, she startled to find Fen staring at her sleeping face with a wild ferocity. She never could have fallen asleep if she'd known Fen stared at her like that. Shang was in a much less comfortable position than she was. His back arched almost painfully as he was held up by his limbs, his stomach and hips overhanging the rocks below. His body was completely still, but his eyes darted through the foliage, ever-focused and razor-sharp. Meiling searched as quickly as possible. A cursory glance over the entire area showed no stark glows. Perhaps it would be easier to see them at night? She picked one vine and, placing one shadowy tendril of a hand on it, followed it around and around the tree branches. The further she followed it, the thicker the vine got, and the more vines converged. Finally, on the ground, by the base of one of the big trees they were suspended between, she found where the vines took root. Still no glow. She stared, stumped. How could a trap be magical if it didn't glow to her sight? Or did only souls glow? Then an idea struck her. She couldn't dig, so she slid into the earth like she did with walls. The difference was immediate. It resisted her, only allowing persistent, sluggish movement as though she slogged through syrup. Nevertheless, she pushed onward against that resistance. She only had to go a foot or two. There. Just below the surface, in a tangle of roots, a massive green glow seeped through the dirt. It was an eerie, froggish green color, so bright in its tiny space that it made Meiling wince. The moment she stopped forcing herself deeper, the ground promptly spat her back out, sending her reeling. She tumbled through the air, head over heels, then wheeled and backed toward Shang and Fen. She hesitated just above his arched back, where his long hair had nearly come free of its neat queue. A sense of guilt and exposure crawled up her spine. Perhaps it would be better if she woke herself up to tell them. Her heart beat faster at the thought of entering his mind when he knew she was there. But no, this was the quickest way for them to be free. Falling asleep once was miracle enough. She wasn't foolish enough to believe it could happen again. With a wince, she cautiously slid into Shang's mind. When she should have found herself surrounded by bone and brain, she floated down through the gold-encrusted ceiling of a grand hall. It had changed. The floor was dusty, not as brightly polished as before. One of the columns started crumbling, as if under terrible pressure. Cracks ran up the spines of more columns, through dragon tails and wings and jaws. The hooks rattled on the curtain rod, making the crimson fabric flutter. Thoughts flew in rapid succession through his mind.
Is the girl asleep? Is she in my mind yet? Will I feel a difference? If Fen dares to make a sound, if the girl doesn't find anything... We've lost so much time already. I need to think of another plan. One of Xuan Wan's minions might come check the trap soon. That could be hours, could be days. If we are here overnight, we'd be a feast for Moagui. Fen could shift again and try to escape. Could this spell get distracted? If Fen shifted again and again, could it grow preoccupied with her to allow me to slash free? How would we brace our fall? The girl couldn't survive such a fall. Fen could shift. I'd manage something.
It was such an avalanche that it knocked Meiling backward. Panic raced every thought, but he fought to keep calm. His body ached from how he was suspended, and she realized he was afraid of heights. She glanced at the cracking columns. The spidery breaks kept forming, all the way up to the painted red and gold gilt ceiling. "I'm here," Meiling whispered into his mind. "I found something." He simultaneously tensed and sagged in relief. He spoke aloud to Fen.
"She's in my mind. She found something."
There was a gasp of relief and then a small cry of pain from Fen. His mind voice was tight when he spoke.
"What did you find?"
"I found what you spoke of, The curse center? What did you call it?
Pressure point, he responded.
It's underground. His hope dashed slightly, and bits of plaster fell from the ceiling. Meiling rushed on quickly. Just below the surface. If you could throw something sharp, like one of your ice bolts, it should penetrate it.
Where is it?
He demanded. This was the part that Meiling was unsure about. It's at the base of one of the trees. The vines converge into one mass of roots. May I see through your eyes? To try to show you? He gave an inarticulate grunting concession. She blinked into his vision and found herself staring at a tall gray trunk right in front of his face. All around, vines hung, ready to snatch and bind. Not that tree, she said. Can you tilt your head to the right?
You can't control it?
He asked.
Control me?
She shook her shadow head, but then said, No, I don't think so. Slowly, painfully, with tension binding every limb tightly, he craned his neck, expanding her view. There, the one in the middle.
With the big knot in the front?
No, the other middle one, she responded sheepishly.
Oh, I see the vines now. Where is the pressure point?
It's... Meiling paused, trying to find the right words. Between the two large roots that come out from the tree, they make a sort of horseshoe shape. In there is the pressure point.
So far away.
His stray thought was not intended for her.
How can I?
She went silent, chewing with shadow teeth on shadow lips. Can you move fast enough to throw it before the vines react? But a plan was already forming swiftly in his mind. She blinked back to his mindscape as it shimmered at the apse of the hall. A ball of light and spirit, bright ice blue. Then she realized it was a part of his spirit. It glittered like diamonds, whirling in a circle, growing thicker and larger with each pulse of his heartbeat. Her lips parted in awe.
Meiling, are you still there?
Hearing her name echoing through the hallway, spoken with his voice, made her almost jolt upward in surprise. Yes, she said. Then, after a second's hesitation, added, Your plan is blue. Sparkly blue. Confusion and surprise rolled through him. Was that also a trace of amusement?
You can see it?
He said. She nodded. Yes.
Do you think it's a good plan?
Why did it matter what she thought? Wasn't she the stupid princess who was supposed to fold her hands and shut up? I do think it's a good plan. Satisfaction moved like a wave through him, and some of his tension dissipated. The cracks in the columns of his hall retreated. Do you want me to stay longer, or wake up? She asked.
Stay. A moment longer.
Then he was speaking aloud to Fen.
You need to shift as fast as you can into different animals. Try to keep the spell busy. I need to shoot the pressure point.
Meiling blinked to his vision and found Fen's eyes bright with the thrill of battle. It will be my great pleasure, she said with a devilish grin. A small inkling emotion of Shang's washed through Meiling. Amusement, and an even tinier inkling of affection. As if remembering Meiling was in his mind, the emotions were swiped away almost faster than she could catch them. But not fast enough, and now she tried to make sense of them. Did Shang have a sort of fondness for his wild, impulsive comrade? They hadn't been romantic feelings, but there had been a distinct warmth. She never would have guessed such a thing from how he spoke to her, so often rebuking, so often arguing. Meiling had the sense that if she wanted to, she could dig deeper into his emotions, pry into the most secretive parts of him until she knew him better than he knew himself. Let me know when, Fen said. Shang's mind completely focused on how to hit that soft spot on the ground. He twisted ever so slightly, trying to get at a better angle, but his movements were met with the tightening of his bonds. Frustration swept through his soul. Meiling listened quietly as his calculating thoughts spilled onto the hall floor and ricocheted off the walls. He thought so differently than she did. It was not just that he thought different thoughts or thought about different things. He saw life and the world differently from her. How, he thought, was so different from her. It fascinated her. He remembered her.
You still there?
Yes, she answered. She almost defensively reminded him that he'd told her to, but stopped herself. How should I keep from falling?
I don't know,
He admitted.
Fen, if we successfully destroy the trap, will you be able to keep Meiling from falling?
2 times in the last few minutes, he'd used her name, instead of simply referring to her as the girl or highness. Impossible to know, Fen responded. We don't know what will happen if we break the spell.
She's right,
Shang thought to himself. To Meiling, he said,
We'll keep you from falling. But if something happens...
Meiling saw through his eyes how he tilted down to look at the ground, felt how his stomach fluttered with dread.
It's not that far.
A blatant lie.
You can survive a fall such as that.
Not quite a lie, but he didn't think she could survive it.
But you need to roll when you land to keep from injury. Understand?
What about the rocks? She squeaked. He let out an audible sigh.
I won't let you get hurt.
Those words were paired with a swift, deep determination. A determination wrought of iron. She believed him. Not because he knew how to save her, but because Shang was a man of his word. I trust you, she whispered. At the sound of her words, a strange and unnameable emotion flashed through Shang. Perhaps it held the slightest hint of warmth.
You can go now,
he said. Do you want me to wake up, or wait a bit longer?
Wake up.
She floated upward into that golden ceiling and slid out of his mind. She regretted it, if she was honest. There was so much he knew that she did not, so much mind to explore. But she respected his privacy, had invaded more of it than he likely realized, and would not overstay her welcome. She regretted that it was pain and panic awaiting her in her own bound body. With a lingering sigh of reluctance, Meiling braced herself and slipped back into her mind. She blinked awake. And what a rude awakening that was. Chapter 18. The moment she opened her eyes, panic closed around her chest like an iron cage. She gasped, breathing heavily. The vines constricted, making her gasp again and struggled desperately to not struggle. Shang's back hit hers, and somehow being within close physical proximity after being in his mind flustered her even more. She remained suspended high in the air, that wretched vine wrapped far too tightly around her waist. Fen's face hung red near hers. Nice nap? Fen asked. Meiling did not answer, partially because if she opened her mouth, she'd scream, and partially because Shang shouted.
Now!
Suddenly, she was suspended with her face far too close to a roaring tiger clawing at the vines. Now she did scream, and tried to scramble away by instinct, but the vines pulled taut and painfully tight. Then Fen was a bird, a coyote, an elephant. When she shifted into an elephant, several vines snapped, and Meiling found her nose pressed into the folds behind the elephant's ear. The strangest smell assaulted her lungs. She let out a cry, trying and failing to keep still while terrifying animals flashed and clawed and trumpeted so close to her. Something hit her shoulder. She looked just in time to watch Shang's ice bolt plunge straight into the soft soil beneath the tree, where the vines converged. He cried out as he did it, as if the motion were excruciating. The vines holding Meiling shuddered.
Meiling!
She twisted to see Shang catch hold with one arm and leg of a branch as he broke free of the vines. He wrapped the other leg around the branch and reached out toward Meiling. She twisted awkwardly as Fen shifted into a hawk and disentangled herself. Snap! Shang swung out further just as Meiling tried to launch herself toward him. The vines broke. She started slipping. She would hit the rocky ground and spill her guts beneath the trees. An arm grabbed around her waist, gripping the vine that was still tightly tied around her, and pulled her out of the air just before she fell. Her forehead hit the bark hard. Stars spun in her vision, dizziness whirling her thoughts. Somehow, she clung to the underside of the branch with one arm and leg, and Shang's neck with the other arm. He was gasping. Her lungs heaved along with his. She was almost upside down, holding onto the branch and Shang. He kept that iron grip on her waist. His face was very close to hers, but he didn't look at her. His eyes darted around wildly, then squeezed shut with a grimace.
Fen!
He cried. The hawk had already lighted on the nearest branch and shifted. Fen was in motion instantly, moving to crouch on their branch.
Meiling!
Fen called.
Let me pull you up!
Meiling shook her head frantically.
I'll fall if I let go!
She wailed. A tear squeezed out of her eye.
You won't fall,
Shang said, his eyes finally meeting hers. His were so close, round and terrified and so black.
You said you trusted me,
he gasped.
Let Fen.
He trailed off, grimacing again.
Meiling!
Fen shouted.
I've got you! Give me your hand!
With a cry, Meiling let go of Shang's neck and flailed her arm toward Fen. Fen caught her above the elbow, straddling the branch as she pulled. Meiling's leg was wrenched free of its hold on the tree, and she squeaked, certain she was about to be dropped. Her legs dangled over the drop, one arm in Fen's yanking hands and the other holding onto the bark for her life. Fen let out a great roar and pulled with all her weight. Meiling flopped onto the branch with a cry of relief. But before she could relax, Fen was tugging her upright.
Away,
she said.
Get on this branch. Shang needs room to climb up.
With near useless limbs, Meiling crawled to the higher branch. Her palms scraped on the sharp bark. This trembling was going to make her lose her grip and topple to her death. Fen was attempting to haul Shang up with loud grunts. He gasped when, by a combination of their strength, he pulled himself onto the branch. He straddled the branch and leaned against the trunk, closing his eyes, but then opening them a split second later, perhaps afraid he would fall. He glanced at Meiling. Thank you, she chattered. He nodded and said nothing, closing his eyes again while bracing himself with his hands. Meiling turned her attention to Fen. Thank you. Fen breathed hard but tried to shrug nonchalantly.
It was nothing.
Shang gasped a half-laugh.
Nothing,
he repeated.
If only both of you could fly too,
Fen grumbled.
Then it really would be nothing.
Meiling laughed, much harder than the words merited, but she was near delirious at this point. And then both Fen and Shang were staring at her, and she couldn't stop giggling. Perhaps she was delirious. She shut her mouth and tried to breathe deeply.
Let's get down,
Fen said. The thought of climbing down a tall tree after nearly plunging to her death made Meiling wince. She summoned her courage and did not hesitate when Fen offered her a hand. Each movement was painfully slow and shaking. Shang took the lead, climbing down and finding the best path. Fen was nimblest, but she was shockingly patient as she aided Meiling. Not, of course, without a few barbed words.
Pick up the pace. You're slower than a line for sweetheart cakes at New Lights.
They were almost to the bottom. Shang swung from the lowest branch and rolled when he landed, springing back up to squint at Meiling and Fen's progress.
It's a bit of a drop at the bottom,
he shouted upward. They reached the last branch. Meiling's legs quaked on the branch. She was so ready to be back on the ground again. She settled herself into a sitting position on the branch next to Fen, who eyed the ground.
Here,
Shang offered, coming to stand below the branch.
I'll catch her.
You'll break your back,
Fen snorted.
She's not heavy,
he said.
It's only a few feet.
This seemed like a questionable plan of action. Nevertheless, she scooted to the edge of the branch. Any particular way you want me to fall? He positioned himself directly beneath her, holding out his arms.
No, just don't leap over my head.
I'll do my best, she said, smiling despite herself. Why was everything so hilarious when she was terrified? He gave her a narrow look, as if he had no idea why she was smiling. He probably thought she'd lost her mind. It hardly mattered. With a deep breath and a squeak, Meiling pushed herself off. She didn't know if she was screaming. It sounded perhaps like someone was. The fall was short, but every second was an eternity of weightlessness. And then she stopped falling. She blinked open her eyes and found herself staring at Shang's face, caught in his arms. She had not died. He'd caught her, like he said. He was already setting her down. She stumbled on her feet, but he gripped her upper arm to keep her from falling. I feel like a baby learning to walk for the first time. She laughed again, taking a tentative, trembling step. They were back on the ground. Everything was wonderful in the world. They had escaped and she had helped. She grinned, silly with relief. Fen swooped down and then shifted into herself. She eyed Meiling oddly.
Did you drug her?
She asked Shang with a raised eyebrow. Shang's black eyes darted to Meiling while she was still grinning stupidly despite her best attempts to compose herself. His eyebrow quirked.
No, but it's not a bad idea.
Meiling's eyes flew wide. Then it was Shang who was smiling. At her, without a dangerous undercurrent. It was a mischievous smile, almost a smirk. If her mind had felt addled before, now it was even worse. She spun away, almost pitching forward, looking for her horse. Spying her pretty gray dappled mare, she stumbled over to it along the rocky ground. Beau had either jumped or fallen out of the saddlebag and rolled around on the ground with his bandage fallen around his hips like a loincloth. Meiling laughed, swaying as she crouched beside him and rubbed his head. You're so adorable, she cooed. So fluffy. He batted at her hand, grabbed it with his paws, and pulled it to his mouth to chew. No, Meiling laughed again, drawing her hand away and nearly falling as she tried to stand. She wanted to collapse into bed and sleep for hours, except her mind was too loud. She was not tired, per se, but her body shook from the strain. All she wanted to do was collapse somewhere and listen to people tell funny jokes and laugh until her sides ached. She was mad, utterly mad. She had never been so terrified in her entire life.
We'll keep riding,
Shang said, his voice mostly normal and even, as if they had not almost been ripped to pieces by spelled vines.
But the day is lengthening, and we'll need to stop soon.
Then he eyed Meiling.
Keeping that vine as a memento?
She looked down and found the vine still knotted around her waist. She laughed again, pulling out her penknife. I finally get to use it, she said, grinning to keep from laughing. Shang looked almost concerned as he mounted his horse. His brow wrinkled, and hesitation sparked in his eyes. Fen was tromping back out of the forest, bringing her wandering, baleful-eyed horse after her. She scooped up the panda under one arm, and its limbs flopped with each of her steps.
You are strange when you're scared.
She had to stop laughing. But how could she when everything was hysterical? She breathed through her teeth, trying to compose herself. Breathe, breathe, breathe. She needed to mount. Yes, that was something to focus her mind on. She had no strength, but Shang had already mounted, which meant that, strength or no strength, she needed to do the same. Suppressing weakening giggles, Meiling heaved her weight up and successfully ended up back on the ground.
Need help?
Shang asked, his voice tinging with annoyance. I'll manage, she said as she attempted another leap into the saddle. Almost. She almost successfully got her leg over the other side of the horse. If only this horse wasn't tall, and it seemed like she twisted the saddle with how much weight she placed on the one stirrup. Shang moved to dismount. With a determined, bounding leap, Meiling flung herself upward. Her ankle made it over the saddle. After that, it was only a matter of scuffling and scooting until she was finally settled in the saddle. Satisfied, Shang turned his horse around and let Fen take the lead down the rocky terrain. Meiling imagined what she must have looked like, jumping and crawling into the saddle. She nearly burst into another fit of laughter, but instead controlled it to an incessant chuckle that she tried to hide by ducking her head. Shang caught it. He twisted back to look at her and proceeded to roll his eyes. She grinned stupidly. They must think her an absolute idiot. She was so relieved to not be dangling high above sharp rocks, tangled up in vines. So relieved. Chapter 19. Shang called an early stop for the day. He gave no explanation, and neither Meiling nor Fen asked. Apparently, they were all still a little rattled after the vines. Her giggles had faded hours ago, and now her mind pulsed with a dull throb, trapped inside her aching body on this jerking horse. She hoped Shang would come and help her down. She was so exhausted, still weak from earlier, and she didn't want to muster the energy to dismount. But Shang did not so much as glance at her as he dismounted, tied his horse, and set to work. She sucked in a breath of air and forced her stiff body into motion. It might not have been the most graceful dismount, it definitely wasn't, but she didn't end up flat on her back. She celebrated by arranging the fire after fishing through Fen's saddlebags for the tinderbox and gathering whatever small brush and sticks she could find nearby. Since it was still bright out, she didn't light it yet, opting instead to ensure everything was prepared so they wouldn't have to hunt for wood in the dark.
Go water the horses,
Shang ordered Fen, pulling the saddle off the last animal.
Once I'm done helping the panda,
replied Fen archly. Shang let out a deep sigh, setting his jaw.
You know you cannot keep it.
Fen looked up from where she inspected the cub's healing wound and gave him a wolfish growl, as though daring him to try to take it from her.
It's already endangered us, and it's healed. You need to let it go.
It's not fully healed.
Don't make me get rid of it for you.
If you hurt him,
I didn't say I would hurt it.
You'd be killing him to throw him out in the wilderness now. He's just a baby.
It's old enough to survive on its own, and you know it.
Bo squealed and flapped his arms, nearly making Fen lose her grip on him. Meiling smiled, drawing her cloak closer around her as she gave a little shiver. Her smile quickly faded. Shang was right. They couldn't keep bringing a pet along with them. What if they encountered those brigands again? Or another Mwagway? Even if the panda would struggle on its own, it would probably be better off than continuing with them.
Horses, Fen,
Shang ordered. Fen shot him a dark look, but set the panda down, away from its pile of excrement, and stalked to the horses, grabbing their leads. "Come on, you big idiots." "Are we still near the stream?" Meiling asked. "Is that where you're taking them?" "We've been following it all day, Highness," retorted Fen. A muscle jerked in Shang's jaw, but he remained silent as he unpacked a few things from his saddlebags, including a fresh quiver of arrows for his Jian. What did he need that for? Meiling bit her lip, not wanting to voice her request. In the end, she didn't know when she'd get another opportunity. She swallowed her fear as best she could and said, "Would there be part of the stream that's not so rapid?"
what is it that you want?
Shang asked, cutting off Fen's reply. A bath? She had never been so stinky and disgusting in her life. Shang and Fen might be used to the grimy, unwashed life, but Meiling didn't know how many more days she could tolerate wearing the same 3 sets of clothes. That is, she'd tolerate whatever she needed to tolerate, but if she could take a bath, perhaps wash the clothes she wasn't wearing.
There's soap in your saddlebags,
said Shang crisply.
Stay with Fen. Fen, don't let her out of your sight.
I do love watching royals bathe.
For once, Meiling was glad for Fen's sarcasm. She hurried to her saddlebags, rifled through them until she found an unscented block of lye. There was no towel, of course. She'd just have to use her cloak. This was going to be quite an adventure. She gathered up her dirty clothes and the soap. And then, to her surprise, a folded blanket landed on top of the clothes in her arms.
Take that,
Shang said with a grunt.
The water will be very cold.
Meiling blinked twice at him, then gave a small smile and nod in return. He turned his back to her, busying himself once again with his Jian before she could thank him. Adjusting the string or something? She shrugged and hurried after Fen and the horses, and Bo, who scampered on all fours at Fen's feet to keep up with her. It wasn't far to the stream. The water level had gone down since her previous, swim. It was still fuller than it should be, judging by the number of trees with submerged trunks, but the flow was wide and sluggish. Nothing like yesterday. Meiling glanced back toward the camp, holding her bundle tighter to her chest. She let out a sigh of relief when it wasn't visible through the trees. Fen brought the horses down to the bank, and Bo followed, almost pitching himself into the water with his enthusiasm. "Well, get busy, Highness," she said, folding her arms over her chest. Was she intending to just stare at her like that? Not even feign interest in something else? Meiling sighed, trying not to care as her cheeks flushed hot. She'd just have to pretend Fen was one of the maids who regularly helped her bathe at the palace. And she'd have to move quickly if she wanted any hope of washing her clothes before Fen got bored. Giving one last glance back the way they'd come, confirming there were no male gazes in the vicinity, she stripped as quickly as she could and stepped into the stream before she could stop herself. And nearly screamed as the icy water closed around her body. Fen snorted. "You were the one who wanted to bathe." Meiling's teeth chattered as she ducked deeper into the liquid ice. Her hand shook as she reached for the soap. She could hardly convince her limbs to work as she scrubbed her skin. How did Shang handle being an ice wielder? Was he cold all the time? Only when he used his powers? Or was he resistant to the cold? Ugh, this was utter misery. She worked as quickly as she could, despite her frozen limbs. Fen threatened her wandering horse with mane braids if he didn't cooperate. All while the panda, apparently feeling much better, rolled around on the ground and attempted to climb one of the trees on the bank of the stream. He quickly gave up, resorting to sniff her pile of clothes. He took special interest in the blanket Shang had given her, rubbing his face on it and chewing on the corner. Just her hair now. Meiling gritted her teeth, bracing for the shock, and then submerged her head. Could eyelashes freeze? Hers froze. The cold was so intense it seemed to burn straight through her lids into her brain, paralyzing her. She barely managed to scrub the soap into the roots of her hair before she was simply too cold. She rinsed her hair, tuning out Fenn's haranguing of the animals until she let out a high-pitched shriek.
Put that back, you four-legged terror, or I swear I'll shave you bald! Bo! Get back here!
Meiling opened her frozen eyelids, and then opened them some more as bile burned in the back of her throat. Bo had sunk his teeth into the blanket and bolted for the forest, running for all he was worth. Fenn tore after him, yelling obscenities and cursing his mother. No! Meiling wanted to cry, but she couldn't find her voice. She whimpered instead, shivering so hard she could barely control her movements. She had to get out of the stream. Blanket or no, she'd freeze to death if she stayed here. She forced her legs into motion, crossing her arm over her chest as she reached out with a numb hand for her cloak. It wasn't thick and warm like the blanket, but it would just have to do. Drawing it tightly around her body, she dropped onto the grassy bank in a sunny spot. Just a few minutes, she told herself, teeth chattering as she trembled from head to toe. Once she was warm enough to move, she'd get up, dry herself off, dress, and then figure out how to wash her clothes.
Meiling!
That was definitely a man's voice. Shang's voice. She was still too cold to move, but not too cold for the sudden, all-consuming burst of panic. Shang? His footsteps pounded toward her, slid to a stop, and then he was kneeling over her, a hand gripping her shoulder.
Meiling, what happened? What's wrong? Are you hurt? Fathers, you're cold as ice. Where is Fenn? Who screamed?
He flung his own cloak over her, and despite it belonging to an ice wielder, it was so warm. She's chasing Panda, Meiling managed. Shang let out a growl, but made no comment about Fenn or the panda, which was an odd relief to Meiling.
Are you hurt?
She shook her head.
Just cold?
A trembling nod.
From the river?
Another nod.
Where's the blanket I gave you?
Panda? Shang sat back on his haunches, shoulders sagging as he ran a hand down his face. He looked like he'd just had a heart attack, whether from Fenn's shriek or finding Meiling curled up in a ball by the river, or both. She wasn't sure. She drew both cloaks tighter around her, far too aware that she wore nothing beneath them. Shang seemed to realize the same thing at once, because he withdrew his hand and pointedly averted his gaze. Just in time for Fenn to come marching back, a floppy, upside-down panda in one arm and the blanket in the other. She met Shang's dark glare with one of her own. I was getting the blanket for Her Highness, so don't lecture me. He didn't lecture her. One look from him was lecture enough, though possibly not for Fenn. He held out his hand for the blanket, and she tossed it to him. With a quick sweep, he added the blanket to the two cloaks, and despite her shivers, Meiling chuckled. I think I can...
I'll carry you back, and then you can dress in your tent.
That bolt of panic lashed through her again. What if the cloak slipped while he carried her? What if... He reached toward her to tuck the blanket around her. She caught his wrist, stopping him. I'm fine, she said. I'd still like to wash my clothes, if that's all right. It was only then that she noticed the loaded Jian hardly a foot away from her, as though he'd flung it down when he'd dropped to her side. She ducked her head a little lower in the folds of the blanket as Shang's jaw worked. He stood, snapped something on his john, and holstered it. Then he grabbed the pile of clothes she'd taken off, leaving the other pile she'd set aside for washing, and tucked it under his arm. What was he? Then he crouched next to her, and she barely had time to yelp before he tucked the blanket tightly around her and scooped her up into his arms. "Shang!" she cried, clutching the layers of fabric closer as her wet hair dripped down her neck and back.
"I don't have the choice to leave you,"
he said, his low voice as cool as ever.
"You cannot stay here by yourself."
With that, and nothing more, he marched back up the slope to the campsite, dodging around low shrubbery and ducking under branches. Between the layers of fabric and his body heat, the coldness started slipping away, replaced by warmth. Except her wet hair. She didn't dare cling to Shang's neck for fear of dislodging the blanket, so she dug her fingernails into the thick material and squeezed her eyes shut as a gentle breeze blew against her bare feet.
"We're at your tent. You can open your eyes now."
"Oh!" was all she could manage as he bent, setting her on her feet and opening the flap of her tent. She hugged the blankets tighter around her and couldn't bring herself to glance back at him as she scurried through the opening. They closed behind her, and she plopped on the ground, holding her cold fingers over her warm cheeks. The blanket sagged from her shoulder. Movement made her glance up frantically. Shang's hand had thrust through the flaps, holding her clothes. She grabbed them quickly, and his hand retracted. "Oh, fathers," she groaned, and a little shiver raced down her spine with another bead of water dripping from her hair. As quickly as she could, she dressed, pressed as much of the water out of her hair as she could, and combed her fingers through the knotted strands. It took much more time than she liked, but part of her was glad to have a reason to not leave the tent just yet. Once she was through, she paused, took a few deep breaths with her eyes closed. She didn't want to go back out there. Maybe she could stay here. It would mean skipping dinner, and yes, she was famished, but would it be that terrible? She let out a soft groan, pressing the heel of her palm into her eye socket. It would be cowardly to keep hiding in here. With one more fortifying breath, she gathered her cloak and Shang's and the blanket, all varying degrees of damp, and ducked out of the tent. The sun was just setting, sunlight fading to dusk. The panda lay on his back in the middle of the campsite, gnawing on a shoot of bamboo, heedless of Shang stepping over him with a pile of sopping wet clothes over one arm. Was that a clothesline? Where had he found the string? Were those her clothes? Had someone washed them? Shang had made Fen do it, hadn't he? She swallowed, then hurried to his side as he draped the pile of wet clothes over the line. "I can do that." He glanced down at her. Without a word, he returned his attention to the dripping clothes, grabbed the topmost garment, one of her tunics, and wrung the water out of it before hanging it on the line. The next thing on the pile was one of her underthings. She snatched it quickly before he could grab it, wringing it out with twitching fingers, and then suffered a long internal debate about where to hang the garment. Would it be worse to scurry back to her tent, to lay it out on the ground? She opted to hang it on the line, hoping beyond hope that he either wouldn't notice or wouldn't care when she half-tucked it beneath the tunic he'd already hung. It was a little ambitious to think Shang wouldn't notice. He noticed everything. Trying not to betray her embarrassment, she added the cloaks and blanket to the pile before grabbing the smaller items to wring out. They worked in silence as the sun descended, casting the world deeper into shadow. Meiling still hadn't lit the fire, but it wasn't like she was about to leave Shang to wring out her clothes by himself. He was apparently determined to finish the job. There were so many things she wanted to ask him, Questions about the academy, about his studies, his magic, his family. She doubted he would be interested in answering such questions, so she kept quiet except for a quick, "Where's Fen?" The horses were back, hobbled at the edge of the campsite, so she couldn't still be down at the stream.
Hunting.
Did that mean they wouldn't be eating jerky tonight? Meiling bit her lip to keep from grinning in sudden anticipation. How long will she be gone?
She'll be back soon.
Hardly 20 minutes passed before Fen returned with a brace of rabbits, during which they finished hanging the rest of the clothes, and Meiling set to work finishing the fire she'd started earlier. "See these rabbits?" Fen said, stopping and glaring down at the panda still lying in the middle of the campsite. "This is going to be you if you don't behave." Meiling's eyes widened, and if she hadn't clapped her mouth shut, she might have burst a shocked, "Fen!" She stole a glance at Shang. His hard mouth twisted just slightly in amusement. Bo flung his stubby legs wide and squeaked at Fen, abandoning his bamboo. "What are you doing with the Johns?" Fen asked, glancing at Shang, who was seated with one of them in his lap, the other propped up next to him. He didn't look up.
Recalibrating and checking the strings.
Fen gave a little shrug, setting the rabbits down on the ground. Meiling didn't want to watch her gut them, so she bent her head, focusing her gaze determinedly on the wood she arranged, and definitely not on the glint of the knife in Fen's hand.
You forgot the first step.
Meiling startled, looking up to find Fen hovering over her work.
Remember the... Oh.
She peered closer and ignored Meiling's bewildered face.
Oh,
she repeated gruffly.
I couldn't see it well. Never mind. I'll get some bigger logs to last us through the night before I start these rabbits.
Then,
have you seen your face? You have a knot on your forehead the size of Junning High.
Meiling let out a relieved puff of air and continued her work as Fen stalked away from the campsite, heading into the forest before the sun fully set. She tentatively reached up to her forehead. There was indeed a large bump. It ached when she touched it. So that was why her head had been hurting all afternoon. It must have been from when Shang grabbed her out of the air and pulled her into the tree branch. Had that only been this afternoon?
Come here.
Shang's low voice sounded from across the campsite. Why? Meiling blurted, frowning at his commanding tone.
So I can ice your forehead.
I'm almost finished with the fire, she said, a tinge rebelliously. She never would have disregarded her parents' instructions so flippantly. But Shang was not her parent, and she was discovering that rebellion was surprisingly thrilling. He did not press her as she struck the flint and steel together, trying for a spark. Nevertheless, his gaze burned like frost on her face. Now that Fen had pointed it out, her head really did hurt. She tried not to let the throbbing overcome her vision or slow her work. At long last, the fire caught. She blew on it, coaxing it higher, brighter, hotter. Delaying more than necessary. It was silly, really, but she was getting tired of being ordered around. She half expected Shang to repeat his command, knowing she would break and obey. But he did not. Instead, he gathered his long limbs, stood, and walked over to her side. Where was Fen? Why was she taking so long? Why did Meiling even want Fen here? Shang knelt next to her, one knee planted in the ground. She sighed, scooting so she faced him. Hesitantly, she peered up at him. But he wasn't looking at her. He studied her forehead.
It's swelled a lot in the last few hours. Here.
Before Meiling could protest or pull away, he caught the back of her head with one hand and pressed his other hand, palm down, against her brow. Her eyes flew wide at the sudden cold, her mouth gaping. He did not hold ice to her head, she realized belatedly. Instead, his hand was ice cold. But in a very strange, completely unexplainable way, his hand was still warm. It was like the relief of ice on an ache without the burn. She closed her eyes. This was perfectly soothing and entirely unsettling. The throbbing behind her eyes eased. His hand at the back of her head, pressed over her braid, was warm too. Not cold at all. It was very fortunate indeed that he did not hold ice, for it would be melting against Meiling's flaming skin, dripping into her eyes and down her cheeks. Thank you, she stuttered, opening her eyes to find his gaze fixed on her face. A tiny gasp caught in her throat. He let go of the back of her head, but kept his palm pressed to her forehead, cupped over the bump.
A few more minutes should be enough,
he murmured.
To make the swelling reduce.
Minutes? She wasn't sure she could last seconds. It was soothing, but he was too close. This was too long, too uncomfortable. She couldn't. Fen might walk up at any minute, demand to know what they were doing, and she would be too embarrassed to answer, making it 7 times worse. Shang seemed to have none of these thoughts. He pulled back his hand for a second, eyeing the bruise, and then touched the edge of the knot with his thumb. She winced. He replaced his hand, and a shiver raced down her spine. She looked at the ground, swallowed. She did not want to know if he studied her face, or if he was completely preoccupied by his work. She twisted the sash around her tunic in her fingers, a habit she inherited from Ma. For a moment, her self-awareness was caught away at the thought of her mother, missing her family, and longing for home. Fen's crunching footsteps made Meiling's eyes fly wide, and she jerked back from Shang, cheeks flushed. He tilted his head at her, his gaze raking over every hesitation in her face, as though he read each thought careening around her mind. Then he stood and held out something in his hand toward where she sat on the ground. Ice. He held out a chunk of ice to her. She took it and mumbled a nervous, "Thank you." Her fingers almost stuck to the ice, but she held it to her forehead and immediately felt the difference. It was so much colder, harsher. She alternated which hand held the ice to keep her fingers from freezing. Even though Shang returned to his spot and stared at the fire, she could have sworn his attention lingered on her.
You wouldn't believe how much dead wood there is around here,
Fen announced, entering the firelight and stomping to the fire to dump her impressive load nearby.
So Iceman helped you out, I see. A pity, since you could have almost passed for a horned Qilin.
Rabbit meat and rice were practically delicacies after how sick Meiling was of jerky and rice cakes. She ate gratefully, and if Fen wouldn't snap at her, she might have thanked her. Alas, she didn't trust the shifter to not turn a thanks into an insult. Without a word to the others, she finished her meal and retreated to her tent. It struck her as a little strange after all they'd been through today, but she couldn't forget the conversation she'd overheard only last night. Whatever camaraderie she thought had grown throughout the day was only a tiny step forward from her companions mocking her behind her back, from Shang threatening her this morning. Pompous, superior, judgmental. That was what they thought of her. She would do well to remember that and not try to push the bounds of their friendship. Not try to pretend she was one of them, or hope they could accept her as a magic wielder like themselves. Maybe in time, they would see more of who she actually was, not who they assumed her to be. Maybe they would esteem her, not quite as much as they esteemed each other, but she wasn't asking that. She only wanted them to not hate her. Why did she even care? Was it because their thoughts and feelings of her reflected the general population's? And if she could convince them she was more than they had thought, then perhaps the masses would believe one day? Was that why she couldn't get over this need to be understood for once in her life? She pulled back the canvas flap, silently thanking Shang for always setting it up for her. He had set up her bedroll, too. She undressed quickly and lay down, the smell of grass and dirt filling her nostrils. The night passed too quickly. Her few short hours of freedom and quiet slipped away like her wraith-like form in the depths of midnight. Her mind was too full of faraway visions of flame-blasting phoenixes. Why had there been two? Shang's dangerous smiles and threats, their promise to not report her illegal magic use, the snaking, tangling, spelled Mwagway trap. Crowding those images were memories of her family and her increasing homesickness. Would Pa and Ma have sent her away if they had known what they would encounter along the way? The thought brought back memories of the cloaked figures at the inn. The fire wielder, the wind wielder, the illusionist. Who had sent them? What did they want from her? So many questions, so few answers. Meiling did not dare stay too near the camp, neither did she dare let it out of her sight. She stayed on the fringes of the campsite, flitting around the forest, thinking and thinking, and looking for Mwagway. Fen took first watch, Shang took second. It was during Shang's watch that the panda uncurled itself from the crook of Fen's knees, hopping on all fours to where he was seated by the fire, watching the camp. Meiling hesitated in her own rounds, waiting as the panda scurried to Shang and stood on its hind legs before him. Shang's hard-edged expression softened, just slightly, as he reached out and patted the cub's head. The cub tottered back to the ground, sniffing his boots. Shang leaned back to rifle through the saddlebags. Withdrawing a shoot of bamboo, he held it out to the cub. It sniffed the offering, then accepted it between its teeth, nose twitching. With that and nothing else, the panda turned and ran off into the wilderness. Meiling's jaw dropped, while Shang set in a determined line as he watched it leave. Part of her panicked, the need to retrieve and protect the cub so sharp she could hardly ignore it. But there was no denying that. No matter how much she liked having the furry little guy around, the panda didn't belong with them. It belonged in the wild, and apparently, it had decided it was time to go home. That didn't stop her from following it a little ways, and it didn't stop the way her soul drooped. Impenetrable midnight faded to the purple night before dawn. The early streaks of sun painted the sky pink. Fen wasn't going to be happy when she woke up. Chapter 20. Meiling huddled near the edge of the camp as Shang rose from where he had been keeping watch. He stretched long arms behind him, a mere silhouette against the rising sun from her vantage point. He refastened his hair in its queue, straightened his tunic. Then he knelt, tapped a sleeping Fen, and turned to search the world around him.
"Time to wake up, Meiling,"
he said, staring in the opposite direction of where she even now floated closer.
"Wherever you are."
She blinked in surprise, then returned to her body, her fingers vaporizing as she tried to feel along her soul tether binding her. She placed one tendril of shadow that might have been a toe back in her body and slowly slid all the way back. Her eyes blinked open. It was still dark in her tent. She sucked in a deep, lingering breath, stretched, and went about her preparations for the day.
"Where is Bo?"
came Fen's sudden demand from outside the tent. Meiling closed her eyes, exhaled. This wasn't going to be pretty.
It left.
Silence. Then,
What do you mean, Shangdi? That he left?
I mean exactly what I said. He left. A few hours ago.
more silence. Meiling cringed. She parted the flaps to her tent, just enough to peek through. Fenn's back was to her hands clenched at her side, her legs braced wide as she faced an unperturbed Shang.
You didn't stop him?
She demanded.
He's a wild animal. He's not your pet. You saved him, nursed him back to health. Now he's back where he belongs.
Fenn didn't move, didn't say anything. And that, to Meiling, was more alarming than anything she could have yelled in Shang's face. Who would have thought that the angry shifter was the one to get the most attached to the cub? Shang went back to packing up their campsite. Fenn stayed where she was. The last thing Meiling wanted to do was walk out into this, but it wasn't as though she could hide in her tent all day. She gathered what scraps of courage she could and slipped out of the tent.
Did you see Bo leave?
Fenn snarled, whirling on her. Meiling startled. She stumbled back when Fenn took another menacing step closer.
Did you see when he left?
She nodded.
Are you now as heartless as Shang too?
Fenn demanded. She loomed closer and closer. Did she even realize how threatening her posture was? But there, past the barely contained rage, her eyes shone too brightly. Her mouth twitched, her chin quivering. Oh, Fenn, Meiling said softly. I'm so sorry. Fenn stared at her, shock widening her eyes as they filled with tears.
Sorry?
She croaked.
Sorry? You're sorry that I lost the one thing I cared about on this whole father's forsaken mission? This mission that has ruined my life?
Back off,
Shang growled, grabbing Fenn's shoulder and yanking her back from Meiling.
She's your princess, and this isn't her fault.
Not her fault?
Fenn snarled back, whirling on Shang.
Everything is her fault! If she hadn't had her stupid magic, then we wouldn't be in this position in the first place. I'd be heading north with my battalion. You'd be working in the palace, just as you always wanted. You're supposed to be my ally here, Shang. But you just keep taking her side because...
Fenn glanced back at Meiling, angry tears streaking her face.
Because she's pretty!
Meiling shrank back.
Enough!
You know it's all true!
Shang took 2 steps closer until he towered over Fenn.
Fenn, pull yourself together. This is pettiness. You are a warrior, not a sniveling schoolgirl. I need to be able to count on you. You cannot lose your head over an animal.
Fenn glared up at him, tears dribbling down her cheeks. A barely contained volcano about to erupt. But Shang didn't back down. He faced that explosion, ready to take it, to fight it. Meiling stared at them both, backing up slowly, and barely kept herself from tripping over a tree root. The sound startled Fenn enough that she broke Shang's gaze, wiped her cheek with her sleeve, and stormed away. Meiling let out the breath she'd been holding, her shoulders sagging. Oh, fathers, this was just too much drama first thing in the morning. She went to rub her forehead, only to wince as pain radiated through her skull. Right, she'd forgotten about the bruise. The swelling had gone down mostly, but any pressure was too much. Shang spared her a glance, but said nothing, taking down her tent quickly while Fenn took out a fraction of her anger on the saddlebags, loading them onto the horses with just a tad too much force. Today already loomed so long and dull ahead of her. It wasn't until they were mounted and already traveling that a thought suddenly occurred to her. Shang's burns. She hadn't rebandaged them last night. She'd forgotten everything when he had caught her head and held his cold hand to her forehead. Had Fen bandaged them? Had he himself done it? If so, when? She might have missed it during the night, since she did not stay very close to the camp. She hadn't watched Shang's every move, had preferred to not look at him at all, while he was on guard. He might have done it himself. Or perhaps he wore the same bandage and hadn't applied the salve. He might have borne the pain like a fool, despite aid being near at hand. Whatever had happened, she determined to look at it later and make sure it was still healing properly. They needed to keep it from growing infected. Burns were serious injuries, though one would never guess with how Shang carried himself. She chewed on her lip, peering at him between loose strands of her hair. He was so smart, so careful, so intentional, so strong in so many ways. He would call out for reinforcement when he needed it. But about some things, he would never admit a weakness. And that was a fault of his. Meiling eyed his impassible, stalwart back ahead, his queue falling between his shoulder blades. What sort of family did Tan Shangdi come from? She should know, considering he was the darling of the academy, but she had stopped paying attention to the individual graduates. They ran together through the years. Because while Shang was the wonder of this year, there had been another last year and the year before, and so forth. It was an endless supply of talent that Meiling could never be part of. Could she have been the top of her class? She would be graduating in 3 years if she had joined the academy. Instead of being the cursed princess, the one always shunned from moving in the circles her birthright demanded, she could have been a star pupil herself. But what did it matter? She was being a fool, wasting her mental energies imagining life at the academy. A useless endeavor. And truly, becoming a warrior and fighting Muagway didn't exactly suit her temperament. That wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to not be misunderstood. For hours they rode. If Fen and Shang talked, Meiling couldn't hear it. She doubted they did, however, with the rage simmering beneath Fen's surface. They rode near several villages, but never close. She shuddered, remembering the last time they had ventured into a town. Perhaps the weather would remain clear and there would be no need for an inn. Hopefully. This would be the worst time to deal with another bout of Shang's storm angst. Fen held up a hand. They all stopped. Meiling's stomach plummeted. She shifted into her favorite long-winged hawk and launched herself into the air, leaving Shang to catch the reins of her horse. He glanced back at Meiling and motioned her closer with his free hand. "What?" Meiling began in a whisper.
"Hush,"
Shang said sharply as he tracked Fen's flight over the treetops. She dove. Muagway? Another magic trap? The enemies from the inn? Something else? She came careening back at a breakneck speed. She didn't shift into her saddle like normal, but dropped onto the ground next to her horse. Her muscular frame tensed with preparation for battle, and her eyes blazed. Those eyes also held fear? A tinge of panic? The rage was gone. She ran to Shang's side, grappling for his arm to pull him off his horse.
Come! It's the healer! They've kidnapped her! We've got to save her!
Meiling's stomach and chest tightened. The healer? As in the academy student? The one she'd met back at graduation? The kind, smiling Fei Yan? Shang pulled his arms out of reach and glared at Fen.
"What are you talking about? Who has kidnapped whom?"
Fen had that look. Battle lust and terror mingled in the set of her jaw, the gleaming in her dark eyes, the tension in her shoulders. Li Fei Yan, the healer, has been kidnapped by the brigands from the inn. They have her bound nearby. We can save her.
The brigands. Fen, are you out of your mind?
Shang reached down from his horse and snatched one of Fen's tugging, insistent arms to restrain her. She shot a furious look at him, trying to wrench free.
We cannot rescue the healer. That would put our own mission in jeopardy. We need to get out of here as fast as we can. Mount your horse.
Fen gaped at him.
You're going to leave Fei Yan to those monsters? I'm telling you, we can save her.
If it is indeed the healer, you can be sure an entire company of wielders will be dispatched to rescue her. They will save her. We have a separate assignment. We obey our orders.
Shang's hard face could have been carved from stone. Fen stared, jaw sagging, hands twitching. Stunned. She stepped backward, almost stumbling.
You wouldn't. I can't believe.
Meiling's heart ached with every fast beat. Shang's brow narrowed.
Mount your horse, Fen. Once we finish this job, you can save your friend. If she hasn't already been saved.
Fen stared at him a moment longer, her features settling into disgust. With a whirl of her cloak, she stalked back to her horse.
I'll take up the rear,
she spat. When she wheeled her horse around behind Meiling's, she did not so much as glance at her. Meiling's head whirled. Their enemies were so close, and Fei Yan was in their clutches? What did they want? Had they hurt her? Her breath came fast. She didn't even know who was right between Shang and Fen. In principle, she agreed with Shang and knew he called the right move for their party. There was no doubt a rescue party had already been dispatched for the healer. But those wielders were not here now. Shang and Fen were here now. If Meiling had been kidnapped, she wouldn't want capable people to walk past simply because it wasn't their assignment to rescue her. But it wasn't so simple as that. Engaging with their enemies without reinforcements put Meiling and their entire group at incredible risk. Shang was thinking practically. Seeing Fen so stricken, and so soon after she lost the panda, was nearly more than Meiling could bear. She could almost feel the throb of Fen's heart behind her. Or perhaps that was Meiling's own heart, aching with the terrible imagined fate of poor Fei Yan. She turned to look back at Fen, afraid of what snarling, tormented face would meet her. Instead, her heart lurched, her breath snagged in her throat, and she choked, "Shang!" He twisted in his saddle, his eyes rounded to the size of wide black moons. Then his brow furrowed, and he gnashed his teeth. Fen's horse tromped listlessly after them, the empty saddle rocking on its back with each apathetic step. Fen was gone.